if you were to scan the headlines pretty much any time, it can be a pretty scary proposition, can't it? Whether they're international headlines or national headlines, whether even very local things, most of the things that make the news are very frightening. I hope you're excited about our channel. This is my part of the channel, Adam's Bible Corner, and my goal in my part of the channel is to study the text of Scripture sort of section by section, verse by verse. We're going to be looking at books of the Bible maybe more slowly than you're used to. In other words, we're not going to spend forever on a book, but we're also not going to just overview a book in one lesson. I hope you take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Make sure you hit the notification bell, all the things you're usually told to do. If you're new to our channel, keep in mind that I'm not the only one on here, and these studies are not the only things we're going to do. My wife, Leah, has already released a video about cooking. My daughter has already released a video about braiding hair. We're going to be covering a lot of things about home, family, fun, just a lot of things. But my part of the channel deals with Bible study. And I want to begin with a study for the next several videos that I'll produce on the book of Habakkuk. And you may think, okay, of all the books in the Bible, why would he choose that one? When you think about this Old Testament book, and you may have never studied it before, at least not in depth, I like to give it this title: From Questioning Confusion to Quiet Confidence. Because in this 3-chapter book, that's the journey we are taking with Habakkuk. And when we make application of our lives, we can walk right along with this prophet. Where is God when all these terrible things happen? How does God really know all these dangerous things? Does he really know how evil things have gotten, whether it's internationally, nationally, locally, even our own relationships? Is God really in control? Questions like those fill our minds, even the minds of very faithful individuals. Intellectually, we can know and say, yes, God sees all, yes, God knows all, and yes, God cares. But then when we look at the headlines and look at our own lives, sometimes that questioning, that confusion begins to enter our thinking. And it's important for us to remember that we're not the first one to ask those questions. In fact, the prophet Habakkuk even basically wrestled with God over those same types of questions. He may not have gotten news about a push notification on a smartphone, but Habakkuk simply could not understand the way of the world in which he lived. Nor could he understand how God was going to work things out. And when struggles come, every person is going to ask about God's justice, about God's rule or sovereignty. Habakkuk did. I have. Likely you have. His message, Habakkuk's message, may be 2,500 years old, but the application from this book is just as contemporary as the morning prayers of people who look to God. One writer, and I'll try on these videos, by the way, to give credit where it's due for quotations and allusions. This writer's name is Walter Chantry. He wrote this: the more one listens to the prophet Habakkuk and to God's words in responding to him, the more it becomes profoundly clear that the human condition was much the same then as it is now. End quote. In this first video, we're not going to dive into the text of the book of Habakkuk. We're going to introduce it. We're going to set the stage for some things to keep in mind as we go through this very brief 3-chapter book. So first of all, let's remind ourselves of the type of literature or the setting in Scripture. This is one of those minor prophets, and it's kind of unfortunate that we label those final 12 books of the Old Testament as minor, because we use that word often to describe something that's just not important. But minor prophets are very important. They're typically called minor either because their books are briefer, although that's actually not the case with all of them, or because they may have prophesied to a smaller area. Again, that's not always the case. Collectively, these 12 prophets were known to the Jews as the 12, or the scroll of the 12, or the book of the 12. They were short enough that basically all 12 books could fit on one scroll. Compare that with Isaiah, Jeremiah, which is the longest book in the Bible as far as number of words, and his other writing, Lamentations. Compare it with Ezekiel. Daniel is kind of the outlier of those major prophets, as we call them. Only 12 chapters, but some of those chapters are a little bit longer. But these men, these minor prophets as we call them, lived in various locations. They served for differing lengths of time. They spoke to different people, from kings to commoners. But there's one golden thread that ties all their books and writings together, and that is obviously they spoke a message for God. Of the 12, Jonah is the most well known, which is ironic because his book has the shortest actual prophecy. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Jonah chapter 3 and verse 4. The large portion of the other 11 books is not on story, if you will, or narration, but on background. Instead it's on the actual prophecy itself. Habakkuk is a bit of an outlier, because in Habakkuk, the prophecy is not so much given by the prophet. It's given by God to the prophet. And so let's think about the individual. Who was this man Habakkuk? As is the case with many, if not most, of the minor prophets, we know very little about this man Habakkuk. The book is just simply not concerned with, if you please, his biography or his background. But the text does begin in Habakkuk 1 and verse 1 by telling us that he was the prophet. Now that may seem very simple enough, but it was meant to show that there was an official nature to his work. John Kackelman wrote this. He said, "This term suggests that he was known as a prophet of God," end quote. It's also been suggested that Habakkuk may have been among the group of unnamed prophets who announced the destruction of Jerusalem, and that's in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 10 through 16. There's no way to know it for sure, obviously, because those prophets are unnamed, but the timing lines up, and so some commentators suggest that there's a possible connection there to something else that he did, something specific that he did. But one interesting fact about this prophet is that his name, Habakkuk, is not of Hebrew origin. Scholars suggest, I'm told, that the name Habakkuk comes from a root term that means either to embrace or one who embraces. And we can read too much into that if we're not careful, but there's a point of application that can be drawn there, in that the prophet, by the end of this very short book, embraces God's plan, even though he doesn't understand it. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. So again, biographically, we know very, very little about this man, but we do know he was the prophet, again, possibly meaning he was known as a prophet, and we know what his name means, he who embraces, and that it's not a name of Hebrew origin. But let's think about the historical setting of Habakkuk. How does this book fit with the narrative of Scripture and the narrative of the world? Each book of the Bible, and I hope you'll always do this when you study Scripture, needs to be set in its original time, if we're going to glean from it as much as we possibly can. We may not know, and you can look in commentaries and websites and dictionaries and things, and not find an absolute consensus on the precise year in which Habakkuk prophesied. But I think we can be fairly certain of the period of time, as both the Lord himself and Habakkuk in this book reference what is happening or about to happen. And so we may not know the exact year. We can know the process that's going on, the realm of time, the scheme of time. The scheme of time that's going on. It is clear from the book that Habakkuk was working during the later stages of the Assyrian Empire's stronghold over Judah. It was a time when the Babylonians, sometimes called the Chaldeans, and some secular historians will call this the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when they were rising to power. And they were powerful enough that under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, one writer says, the Babylonian army overthrew Nineveh in 612 BC, forcing the Assyrian nobility to take refuge, end quote. And so with that power struggle ongoing, some smaller nations that were under Assyrian rule, well, they were kind of caught in the middle, as you can imagine. They're caught in the crosshairs. Here are these two massive empires, and you're just a small group of people. And among those nations that was sort of caught in the crosshairs was Judah, whom Habakkuk was to give a message from God. So that's the historical setting. Now, as we think about just overviewing the book, I want to share with you two keys to understanding Habakkuk. Even though it's very brief, Habakkuk can still be a struggle for some people to understand, including me. Frankly, I don't do poetic language all that well, so prophecy books are very difficult for me. But still, there are some keys to understanding this book that make it a lot. One is the style of the book, and the other we'll talk about very briefly is an outline of the book. But think first of all just about the style of the book. Some like to call the style of Habakkuk complaint answer. The complaint answer style. This book is a book of prophecy, but we don't see in the book where Habakkuk actually delivers the message. Because the book ends the way that it does in Habakkuk chapter 3, we really have no doubt that Habakkuk faithfully executed his work, but him actually giving the prophecy is not found in it. Instead, the book is more about how the prophet wrestles with the message that God is giving him to deliver. God has a message that needs to be said, but it doesn't fit the thinking of Habakkuk. And so the prophet struggles with the Lord. He strives to understand the reason for this difficult message. Jack Lewis, a number of years ago, wrote the following brief paragraph. He said, quote, "The book of Habakkuk, a book of excellent poetic form, is written in the style of a complaint and an answer. In contrast to the other prophets who address themselves to Israel in order to declare the will of God, this prophet addresses himself to God on behalf of Israel." End quote. We can understand that difference. It helps us to grasp this book and follow the flow of the book of Habakkuk. While we don't see, as we said, the prophet delivering the message, we do see how he was able to speak openly with the Lord, even though he couldn't understand and maybe didn't want to understand all that he was to deliver. So the style of the book is what some call complaint and answer. I'm going to cry out to God, and then God responds to the prophet. Here's what's going on. But also, to understand the book, think about an outline. It's a very short book, 3 chapters, and you can actually divide it into just 2 parts. And the first 2 chapters, Habakkuk chapters 1 and 2, are the complaint and answer section that Dr. Lewis noted in the quote we mentioned above. Habakkuk has 1 complaint in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. The Lord responds with an answer in Habakkuk 1, verses 5 through 11. A longer complaint from the prophet is then expressed in chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2 and verse 1. And the Lord responds with a longer answer found in chapter 2, verses 2 through 20. That's the first part of the book. Complaint, answer, complaint, answer. But upon hearing the message of the Lord, Habakkuk then writes or states a prayer that fills all of what we know as chapter 3. And it's obvious from that prayer that even the prophet does not fully understand everything that the Lord is doing. But it's also obvious from that prayer, or that praise, that he trusts in the Lord. And so you might outline the book, and by the way, this is how we're going to follow in these videos, this way. Major point number 1, the questions of Habakkuk. And that's chapters 1 and 2. And we've already talked about it. You have the first complaint or question, God's response. The second complaint or question, and God's response. And the major point number 3 is the praise of Habakkuk, or Habakkuk's praise. That's chapter 3. And he does 3 things. He prays for God's mercy, verses 1 and 2. He remembers God's mercy, verses 3 through 15. And he trusts in God's salvation, verses 16 through 19. By the way, that outline is not original with me. It's one I've adapted actually from an online site that I really like. You'll find similar outlines in commentaries and elsewhere. I like this one, so I just adapted a couple of words and made it my own. So this video may seem like a very brief introduction, but in some ways, that is part of the message of the book of Habakkuk, is the brevity of it. It is invaluable that we remember that the final message of this book is not of the prophet's wisdom or the prophet's power, but is really on the ultimate power and overseeing nature of God. God knows the flow of history, and God is in complete control. It reminds us of what Isaiah, another prophet, would say, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts," speaking for God in Isaiah 55 and verse 9. Habakkuk may have never understood the message he was to deliver. He may never have grasped the rationale behind it from God. But in the end, he trusted God. And that's what the Lord desires of us. And so in the next few videos, we go through the book of Habakkuk, we really have two goals. First, we want to make certain that we're true to the original historical context of this Old Testament prophet. While these videos are not meant to be an ongoing commentary, to use that terminology, we will appreciate the text more readily if we do dive into the original meaning and the original meaning to those original readers. But with that knowledge, then, too, we hope to make this book come alive for us today. Even though it's brief, Habakkuk is a very practical book for our modern age. After all, the moral decay we see around us was in view in this book in their time. We see these same types of questions in our time. As one writer I've already quoted, Chantry, asks of our modern world, he said, quote, "How many have recognized that moral and religious decay is so far advanced in Western Europe and the Americas that our only hope to arrest the slide is in the Lord who made heaven and earth?" And then Chantry gave this very good follow-up statement, quote, "Our voices must be raised to God, or complete collapse may not be far off," end quote. The people of God continue to ask, as Habakkuk did, why? And as we do, the message of this prophecy should ring in our ears. God is in control, and we are not. So do we trust Him with the flow of history, even if it means our downfall? And so we'll close by returning to the words of Dr. John Kackelman to end this brief introductory video. He said this, quote, "We can identify with Habakkuk. His struggles with God's justice are common to all who seek righteousness. Let us use him as a pattern for our lives. May we face life's struggles with confidence, knowing that the future holds tremendous blessings for each one who fears and obeys God." I hope these thoughts have helped you get your mind going toward this Old Testament book. I hope before the next video is released, or before you watch the next video anyway, you'll take the time to read Habakkuk. It's only 3 chapters. You can read the whole thing, depending on your reading speed, between probably 5 and 15 minutes. But I really encourage you to read it more than once because it is so brief. Because we're going to be taking this book in very small chunks. If we're not careful, we begin to lose sight of the overall picture. That's why we want to take some time to introduce the book, is to remind ourselves of the background and the overall picture of it. It's a wonderful book, and I hope all these lessons will encourage you. Next time, we will dive into chapter 1, and I hope you'll make sure you're there for that video. Please take the time to subscribe to our channel, not just for the videos that I'm doing from the Bible, but that all of our family is going to be doing about home and family and scripture and just all sorts of things that we want to use to encourage you through these videos. So subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and be back with us next time on the Fawn Family of 4.